You know, people often think they understand strength. They imagine big muscles, loud voices, dramatic punches. But nature and life almost never works that way. The real interesting things, the really powerful things, they look simple at first, almost too simple, like a quiet man walking down a street. Now imagine this. A couple of fellows decide to steal $300 from that quiet man. In their minds, it's a straightforward calculation. 2 guys, 1 victim, quick profit. Very ordinary physics of the street, right? But here's the funny part about the universe. Sometimes you pick the wrong variable, because the man they chose wasn't just some random passerby. The man they chose was Bruce Lee. And what fascinates me about this story isn't just the fighting. Anyone can throw a punch. What fascinates me is what happens in the seconds after a mistake collides with mastery. When arrogance meets precision. When 2 thieves suddenly discover that the laws of motion apply to human bodies too. And the most interesting question isn't what Bruce Lee did next. The interesting question is why those thieves regretted their decision almost immediately. You know, one of the most interesting things about life is that very small decisions can suddenly collide with something far bigger than we expect. We often imagine big consequences coming from big actions, but the truth is, the universe doesn't always behave that way. Sometimes the smallest, most careless choice runs straight into something extraordinary. Imagine 2 young men on a street at night. To them, the situation looks simple. They see a man walking alone. They make a quick calculation in their minds. 2 against 1. Easy money. $300. A fast opportunity. In their world, this is just another ordinary moment. Nothing special. Just a small decision made in a few careless seconds. Now, what fascinates me about situations like this is the way people make judgments with very little information. The human brain loves shortcuts. We look at appearances and instantly build a theory. We say, well, that person looks like this, so they must be that. We don't measure carefully. We don't experiment. We don't investigate. We simply assume, and assumptions can be very dangerous when reality turns out to be different from the model in your head. So those 2 men see a person who appears calm, quiet, not looking for trouble, maybe even smaller than they are. Their theory forms immediately. Easy target. That's the model. That's the equation they're working with. And once they accept that equation, every step that follows seems perfectly logical to them. But here's the beautiful and slightly frightening thing about the world. Reality does not care about the equations you invent in your head. Reality only follows the real laws underneath. The man they stopped wasn't just some ordinary passerby. He wasn't just a random variable in their little street experiment. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see from the outside, was that this man had spent years studying the mechanics of the human body. Years studying movement, speed, balance, timing. Years training his mind and muscles to respond faster than most people can even think. This man was Bruce Lee. Now when people hear the name Bruce Lee, they imagine flying kicks and movie scenes and dramatic fights. But what made Bruce Lee extraordinary wasn't just fighting. It was understanding. He studied movement the way a scientist studies nature. He questioned traditions. He tested techniques. He asked, what actually works? And then he practiced until the answer became part of his body. Thousands of hours. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of hours of repetition, strikes practiced again and again, reflexes sharpened, timing refined, balance perfected. Not because he expected to fight thieves on the street every night, but because he believed in mastering the art completely. So now we have an interesting collision. On one side, 2 men making a careless decision based on appearance. On the other side, a person carrying years of discipline, training, and understanding, and the thieves don't see any of that. To them, the situation still looks simple. They approach, they threaten, they demand money. $300. In their minds, the result is already decided, but what they don't realize is that they've miscalculated the entire system. You see, when a person trains long enough at something, really trains, deeply trains, something, remarkable happens. The skill stops being a conscious effort. It becomes automatic. The body responds without hesitation. There's no long thinking process, no debate, just action flowing from practice. Bruce Lee used to say that the highest level of martial arts is simplicity, not complicated movements, not flashy techniques, but direct, efficient action. So when those men tried to take his money, they weren't just confronting a man, they were confronting years of refined instinct. Now this is the point where the universe begins to correct the mistake. Because the thieves thought they were controlling the situation. They thought they had the advantage. But in reality, they had stepped into a completely different environment. One where speed, precision, and awareness mattered far more than numbers. Bruce Lee's entire philosophy revolved around efficiency. Don't waste movement, don't waste energy, don't react emotionally. Respond with clarity. And when you imagine that moment, you can almost see it unfolding like a physical experiment. Two men moving with aggression, but very little control. One man standing calm, balanced, alert. In physics, we talk about reaction, time, momentum, angles, force distribution. Martial arts, when you really look at it carefully, follows the same principles. A punch is not just anger moving through the air. It's a transfer of energy through the body, through the ground, into a target. Bruce Lee understood that better than almost anyone. And so what those thieves thought would be a quick robbery was actually about to become a demonstration of what happens when careless confidence meets precise skill. Because the moment they made their move, the system changed. Their simple plan suddenly encountered speed they weren't prepared for. Movement, they couldn't predict. Control, they couldn't overpower. And the most fascinating part is that all of this came from that very first mistake, a tiny decision made in a moment of arrogance. A quick assumption that someone walking quietly must be weak. That's the thing about mastery. It often looks ordinary from the outside. Years of work can hide behind a calm face. Discipline doesn't announce itself. Training doesn't glow in the dark so everyone can see it. It waits quietly. And when a careless decision finally crashes into that hidden preparation, the result can surprise everyone involved, including the people who thought they had everything figured out. Most people have a very dramatic picture of power in their minds. They imagine loud voices, aggressive behavior, big gestures, people trying very hard to look intimidating. In movies and in everyday life, we are trained to think that the person who makes the most noise is the person who holds the most strength. But if you look carefully at the world, if you observe it the way a curious scientist would, you start noticing something very different. Real power is usually quiet. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to prove itself every few seconds. In fact, the more genuine the power is, the less it tries to advertise itself. Think about something simple from nature. When the wind is gentle, you hear it. Leaves rustle, branches shake, doors creak. But the most powerful forces in the universe, gravity, magnetism, the motion of planets, operate silently. They don't make announcements. They simply work. Human. Strength often follows the same principle. When someone is insecure, they try to look powerful. They puff their chest out. They threaten people. They want others to feel afraid. But when someone truly understands their ability, something interesting happens. They become calm. Bruce Lee understood this very deeply. People often remember him as the fast fighter, the martial artist who could strike with incredible speed. But what made him truly fascinating was the philosophy behind his actions. He believed that martial arts were not about aggression or ego. They were about understanding movement, understanding yourself, and understanding the moment. And when someone reaches that level of understanding, their actions become incredibly precise. Precision is a beautiful thing to observe. In science, when we perform experiments, the goal is not to make huge, dramatic changes. The goal is to make exact adjustments, tiny corrections that lead to reliable results. Bruce Lee approached combat in the same way. He once explained that the best technique is not the most complicated one. The best technique is the one that reaches its goal with the least wasted motion. No unnecessary tension, no extra steps, no dramatic gestures. Just direct, efficient action. Now imagine someone who has practiced this idea for years, every day, training, repeating movements again and again, studying angles, timing, distance, learning how the human body reacts under pressure, learning how balance works, how momentum works, how attention shifts in stressful moments. Thousands and thousands of repetitions. What happens after enough time is something very interesting. The movements become natural. They stop being something you have to think about. They become part of your nervous system, and when a person reaches that stage, their behavior changes. They stop trying to look powerful, because they already know they are capable. Bruce Lee often carried himself with a kind of relaxed confidence. When people met him, they sometimes expected him to behave like the characters in action films, loud, aggressive, ready to fight at any moment. But the reality was quite different. He spoke calmly. He observed people carefully. He smiled easily. His presence wasn't intimidating in the way people expected, and that's exactly why many people underestimated him. The human brain loves visual signals. We like clear labels. If someone looks threatening, we assume they are dangerous. If someone appears relaxed, we assume they are harmless. But reality doesn't always follow those shortcuts. The quiet person in the room might be the one who has spent years developing extraordinary discipline. The calm individual might be the one with the sharpest awareness. The person who isn't trying to impress anyone might actually be the most capable person present. This is what makes quiet power so fascinating. It hides in plain sight. When Bruce Lee walked down a street, he didn't carry a sign that said world-class martial artist. He didn't walk around demonstrating his speed to strangers. He didn't threaten people or boast about his abilities. He simply existed. But behind that calm exterior was an incredible level of preparation. Years of training had built reflexes that were almost impossible to match. His strikes were known for their speed, but speed was only one part of it. What made them effective was precision. A precise movement is very different from a wild movement. When someone throws a punch out of anger, their entire body becomes tense. The motion becomes clumsy. They waste energy. Their balance shifts unpredictably. But when someone strikes with precision, the movement is controlled. The body remains balanced. The force travels efficiently through the muscles and into the target. It's almost like watching a well-designed machine operate. Bruce Lee studied these ideas constantly. He was fascinated by efficiency. He believed that the goal of martial arts was not to collect hundreds of techniques, but to remove what was unnecessary. He used a phrase that captures this perfectly. Absorb what is useful, discard what is useless. That philosophy applied not only to fighting, but to life. Quiet power grows from discipline. It grows from patience. It grows from the willingness to practice something for years without needing applause. And the interesting thing is that most people never notice it until a moment arrives where it suddenly becomes visible. Think about a master pianist sitting at a piano. Before they begin playing, they look completely ordinary. Just a person sitting on a bench. Nothing dramatic happening. But the moment their fingers touch the keys, years of practice reveal themselves in a few seconds. The same thing happens with any form of mastery. Skilled engineer can solve complex problems with a few simple ideas. A trained surgeon can perform delicate procedures with calm precision. A martial artist like Bruce Lee could move with speed and control that seemed almost unreal to people who had never experienced that level of training. But all of it comes from the same place. Quiet preparation. That's why the second keynote of this story matters so much. True power rarely looks the way people expect it to look. The thieves who targeted Bruce Lee that day probably expected a typical reaction: fear, hesitation, confusion. They likely imagined that the man they confronted would panic or try to escape. That expectation came from their understanding of the world, but their understanding was incomplete. Because the person standing in front of them had built something inside himself that they couldn't see. Years of mental focus, years of physical conditioning, years of philosophical reflection about how to respond in difficult situations. When someone has that level of preparation, They don't need to act aggressively to feel strong. Their calmness is genuine. Their movements are deliberate. And when action finally becomes necessary, it arrives with surprising efficiency. Bruce Lee believed that the highest level of martial arts was not about violence, but about control. Control of the body, control of the mind, control of the situation. That's what makes quiet power so remarkable. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It doesn't try to impress. It simply responds when the moment demands it. And when that moment finally arrives, people who relied on noise and intimidation suddenly realize they've misunderstood the situation completely. Because the person they assumed was harmless has been carrying something far more dangerous than anger. Human beings have a very curious habit when it comes to judging situations. We often believe we understand something long before we actually do. We look at a person, a place, or a moment, and within seconds our mind constructs a complete story. We say, I know what this is. And once that story forms, it becomes very difficult to question it. In science, that kind of thinking can be very dangerous. If a scientist becomes too confident in their first assumption, they stop observing carefully. They stop testing their ideas. They stop asking new questions. And when that happens, mistakes begin to grow quietly in the background. The same thing happens in everyday life. Arrogance is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it appears as a quiet certainty in our own judgment. A feeling that we already know enough. A belief that our quick impressions must be correct. When people allow that kind of thinking to guide their decisions, they begin underestimating things they don't fully understand. Now imagine two men standing on a street watching someone walk by. They see a man alone, calm, not surrounded by friends, not behaving aggressively. To them, the situation looks easy to interpret. Their minds run through a quick mental shortcut. One man, two attackers. Simple advantage. In that instant, they stop asking questions. They stop observing deeper details. They stop considering possibilities outside their narrow expectation. This is where arrogance quietly enters the picture. Because the moment you believe you fully understand a situation without careful investigation, you are no longer thinking. You are assuming. And assumptions can collapse very quickly when reality turns out to be more complicated than expected. Bruce Lee often talked about the danger of rigid thinking. He believed that many traditional martial artists became trapped by fixed ideas. They believed certain techniques were always superior simply because they had been taught that way for years. Bruce Lee rejected that mindset. He believed learning required humility, a willingness to question everything. A willingness to admit that something new might work better than something old. In other words, he understood that knowledge grows when arrogance disappears. Now, the interesting thing about arrogance is that it usually hides ignorance behind confidence. When someone truly understands a subject deeply, they become aware of how much there is still to learn. Their confidence becomes balanced with curiosity. They remain open to new information. But when someone understands very little, they often feel extremely certain. This creates a strange paradox. The person who knows the least may sometimes feel the most confident about their conclusions. That kind of overconfidence leads people to underestimate others. The thieves in this story probably believed they had seen hundreds of similar situations before. They had likely confronted other people on the street. Perhaps those people reacted with fear. Perhaps those encounters ended quickly and easily. And so a pattern formed in their minds. Every new situation began to look like the previous ones. But patterns can mislead us if we stop questioning them, because the world is full of exceptions. The quiet person you underestimate might be far more capable than you imagine. The calm individual you dismiss might have years of hidden experience behind their composure. Arrogance blinds people to those possibilities. When those two men looked at Bruce Lee, they probably didn't see a martial artist who had trained relentlessly. They didn't see a thinker who had studied movement with scientific curiosity. They didn't see someone who had spent thousands of hours refining his body and mind. They only saw what fit their expectation, and that expectation made them careless. Bruce Lee, on the other hand, approached life very differently. He believed the mind should remain flexible, open, ready to adapt. One of his most famous ideas was the concept of being formless. Instead of locking yourself into rigid patterns, you remain responsive to the moment. You observe carefully. You react according to what is actually happening, not what you expect to happen. That mindset requires humility, because humility keeps the mind alert. Arrogance, by contrast, makes the mind lazy. It convinces you that you already know the answer before the question has even been fully asked. When the thieves approached Bruce Lee, they were acting on arrogance. They believed the situation was already under control. They believed they understood the dynamics completely. 2 men, 1 victim. But the flaw in their thinking was simple. They had not measured the most important variable: Bruce Lee. This is what makes arrogance such a dangerous force in human decision-making. It encourages people to overlook critical details. It creates blind spots in perception, and blind spots can lead directly into consequences. Think about how often this happens in everyday life. Someone underestimates a competitor. Someone dismisses a quiet student in a classroom. Someone assumes a calm colleague lacks confidence or ability. All of these judgments come from the same source, a belief that we can accurately measure someone's capability with only a quick glance. But reality is rarely that simple. Skill hides beneath the surface. Discipline develops quietly. Experience accumulates without making a loud announcement. Bruce Lee's entire philosophy encouraged people to look deeper than appearances. He believed that understanding required observation, experimentation, and constant learning. He once said that the successful warrior is the average man with laser-like focus, not the loudest man, not the most intimidating, just someone who has dedicated themselves to improvement. The thieves never considered that possibility. Their arrogance prevented them from imagining that the quiet man they confronted might possess extraordinary ability. They assumed the world would behave the way it had behaved before, but the moment they acted on that assumption, they set themselves on a collision course with reality. And reality has a way of correcting arrogance very quickly, especially when the person being underestimated has spent years preparing for exactly the kind of moment that others never think twice about. One of the most fascinating things about human decision-making is how quickly it happens. A moment appears, a thought flashes through the mind, and suddenly an action follows. Sometimes the entire process takes only a few seconds, yet those few seconds can change the direction of everything that comes afterward. People often imagine that life-changing events require long planning or dramatic preparation. But if you observe carefully, you start noticing that many important turning points begin with something incredibly small. A quick judgment, a careless assumption, a moment where someone chooses one path instead of another. It's almost like flipping a switch. Before the switch, everything looks ordinary. After the switch, the entire situation begins moving toward a completely different outcome. Now imagine 2 individuals standing on a street noticing someone walking by. The scene appears quiet, almost unimportant. There's no dramatic music, no warning sign announcing that something unusual is about to happen. Just a normal moment like thousands of other moments in a normal day, and then a decision is made. Let's take his money. That's all it takes. A sentence, a quick agreement, a step forward. In those few seconds, the entire future of the next several minutes changes direction. What makes this interesting is how confident people often feel when making these fast judgments. The human brain is designed to save energy, so it relies heavily on shortcuts. Instead of analyzing every detail, it builds quick predictions based on past experiences. If someone has robbed people before and those situations ended easily, their brain begins to treat the pattern as reliable. The next target looks the same as the previous ones. The same outcome is expected, but the world does not promise that every new situation will follow the same pattern. Every moment carries its own variables. Bruce Lee often spoke about awareness, the ability to truly see what is happening instead of simply reacting through habit. Awareness slows the mind down just enough to notice details others might ignore. But when someone acts purely on impulse, that awareness disappears. The thieves in this story acted in exactly that impulsive way. They saw an opportunity and moved immediately. No careful observation, no curiosity about the person they were confronting, no consideration of unexpected possibilities. Just a quick conclusion. This kind of thinking happens everywhere, not just on dark streets or dangerous situations. Students sometimes assume an exam will be easy because the last one was simple. Business competitors sometimes underestimate a quiet startup because it doesn't look powerful yet. Athletes sometimes assume their opponent will be weak because of appearance alone. In each case, the same pattern appears. A quick judgment creates confidence. That confidence creates action, and that action locks the situation into motion. The interesting thing about irreversible moments is that once the action begins, there is often no easy way to return to the earlier state. A word spoken cannot be unspoken. A punch thrown cannot be paused halfway through the air. Decisions have momentum. Bruce Lee understood momentum not only in the physical sense but in the mental sense as well. When someone commits to an action, their body and mind move forward, together. That forward motion can become very difficult to stop. The thieves had already stepped into that momentum. Their plan had begun. Their confidence pushed them forward. They had chosen their target and demanded money. $300. To them, it probably felt like a routine moment in a routine night. But here is where the fragile nature of quick judgments becomes clear. Because the entire situation was built on one assumption: that the man they confronted would react the way most people react. Fear, hesitation, compliance. If that assumption had been correct, the story might have ended quietly. The thieves might have walked away believing their judgment had once again proven accurate. But assumptions only work when reality agrees with them, and reality can be full of surprises. Bruce Lee represented a completely different variable than the thieves expected. Instead of panic, there was calm. Instead of confusion, there was awareness. Instead of weakness, there was preparation. The entire system changed instantly. Now think about how quickly that shift must have happened. One moment the thieves believed they were in control. The next moment they were facing something completely outside their prediction. This is what makes moments of wrong judgment so powerful. The mind moves forward confidently, and then suddenly reality refuses to cooperate with the plan. And when that happens, people are forced to confront the limits of their understanding. Bruce Lee's training was designed specifically for moments like this. His philosophy emphasized efficiency and speed, but also clarity. When action became necessary, there was no hesitation, because the preparation had already been done long before the moment arrived. Years of discipline create the ability to respond instantly. The thieves, however, had not prepared for this kind of response. Their experience had trained them for ordinary reactions, not extraordinary ones. That difference between preparation and assumption is what transforms a small decision into a dramatic turning point. In one careless moment, the thieves believed they had identified an easy victim. In reality, they had unknowingly stepped into a situation where their understanding of the world was about to be challenged very quickly. All because of a decision that took only a few seconds to make. A few seconds to judge, a few seconds to act,